Welcome to Live Daf, your online Daf Yomi Shir.
Shalom, welcome back to today's Daf, which is Eruvin Daf Lamed Vav. We have two lines from the top. Says the Gemara, Kasha the Rabbi Yossi the Rabbi Yossi. We seem to have a contradiction between the Rabbi Yossi mentioned in our Mishnah, who tells us that when we have a suffix Erev, it's kosher. So for instance, you place some truma food at the Erev site, and you know that it became tummy at some point in time. But we're unsure of whether it occurred prior to Ben Hashmashes, in which case the Erev is not kosher, or it only happened after Ben Hashmashes, in which case the Erev has already been activated during Ben Hashmashes and is kosher. Rabbi Yossi tells us, suffix Erev kosher, and we can rely on this Erev. Now, even if you say the reason is because the entire concept of Tchumen and the Erev Tchumen is only midrabanan, therefore we go to Kula. But this will be in contrast with Rabbi Yossi himself, who tells us in a Mishnah in Mikvahs, if a person became Tomei Etuma Dirabanan, and he went to be Tevel in a mikvah, and there's some suffix as to the kashers of his tefillah. We don't know whether the mikvah was kosher. He doesn't know which mikvah he used. Rabbi Yossi tells us that due to this suffix, he will remain Tomei. So how is this compatible with our Mishnah? Rabbi Yossi tells us that we say suffix l'kula. We adopt a lenient approach. Why, when it comes to Tumah, is he machmer and says this person remains Tameh when there's a suffix? Kasha the Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yossi. Says there are three approaches. Number one, Amar Rav Huna bar Chanina, Shani Tumah. Tumah is different. Hoyel v'yesh le'ikar min ha'Torah. Since it is rooted in Torah, meaning, although in this specific case, this person was only Tumah d'Rabbanan, but the concept of Tumah, we have Tumah is min ha'Torah. So if there's a concern, if we're going to be lenient when it comes to this person's tumah, perhaps this will lead a person to be mezalzel, to negate, to neglect, not take seriously a similar situation when it involves a tumah min haTorah, where we're meant to be machmer because a suffix de'oraisa is meant to go l'chumrah. Therefore, we adopt a stringent approach even when we're speaking about a tumah d'Rabbanan. Says the Gemara, if so, when it comes to Tchumen as well, Shabbos Nami Doraisi. The Gemara figures at this point that the Issa Tchumen is Minat Torah. So how can we say Suffix Erev is kosher? We're meant to go l'chumrah when we have a Suffix Doraisi. Says the Gemara, Kasav Rabbi Yossi, Tchumen d'Rabbanan. He holds that the concept of leaving your boundary, the whole concept of Erev Tchumen is only Midrabbanan. Therefore, we can go l'kula without any concern. Let's take a look at Rashi inside, 15 lines from the top, beginning with the words Hoyel v'yesh le'ikar min ha'Torah. So Gemara tells us that Tumah is unique because it is sourced in Torah. The yesh Tumah min ha'Torah. The concept of Tumah does exist min ha'Torah. V'yesh lahachmer b'suffix tefilasa. In which case, if there is a suffix, whether the person was toivel from a Tumah d'oraisa, we're meant to be machmer, because suffix d'oraisa is l'chumrah. So based on that, lahachi achmer abanon af b'suffix Tvilas, Tumah d'Rabbanan. Therefore, the Chachamim felt it was important to be machmir even when there's a suffix tvila pertaining to a Tumah d'Rabbanan. Why? A person should not come to be mezalzel, to negate and neglect b'suffix tvilas Tumah d'Oraisa. So he shouldn't come to be mezalzel when it involves a situation of a suffix of a tvila of a Tumah d'Oraisa. So because of that, the Chacham will machmir even by a Tumah d'Rabbanan. Says the Gemara, Shabbos Nami D'Oraisa, at Tchumen Paruch. The Gemara is asking on Tchumen, L'meimer Tchumen D'Oraisa. Kurakiva Maseches Eruvin. The Gemara figures that perhaps Rabbi Yossi holds like a Rakiva, that the Issa Tchumen is D'Oraisa. So how can he say Suffix Erev is kosher? What do we machmer? Mishani, the Gemara answers, because Rabbi Yossi Tchumen D'Rabbanan. And therefore, we go L'kula, a Suffix D'Rabbanan L'kula. Adds Rashi, Mishum D'Loi Laisi L'Zazuli B'Shar Sfeikos. The Melechas Shabbos, Lecha L'Mikzah. The question is, well, we know there are other Melachos on Shabbos that are min haTorah. So perhaps we should apply the same reasoning of Tumah to Tchumen. Just as you just told me that you have to be machir by the Tumah d'Rabbanan, so it shouldn't lead to leniencies when it comes to Tumah d'Oraisa. Likewise, you shouldn't be makel by Tchumen, although it's d'Rabbanan, because it might lead one to be makel when it comes to other aspects of Shabbos, like Melachos. That's Rashi lekel and migzah. There's no room for exer. There's no room for concern. The loy damu melachos l'tchumen. Melachos are classified differently than tchumen. Tchumen is merely, don't leave your boundaries. Don't go out of the tchum. Malachos involve creativity, creation. Doing something, making something new. That's a entirely different concept. Just because we're going to be maker when it comes to tchumen, that won't lead a person to apply a kula by malachos zarais. But tuma is all classified as one and the same. They're all very similar to each other. And if we're going to apply a leniency when it comes to tuma d'Rabbanan, perhaps that will stretch into tuma d'Oraisa as well, and therefore Rabbi Yossi is mach. That's the first approach in the Gemara to answer this stira. When it comes to the Erev, Rabbi Yossi is mekel because he holds it d'Rabbanan. In contrast with tuma, he is machmer, although it's d'Rabbanan, because it might lead to further leniencies when it comes to tumas d'Oraisa. Continues the Gemara. 5 lines from the top. V'boyis ema, another pshat to answer this theory. Hadi day, hadi rabbi. Rabbi Yossi himself is machmer even by suffix d'Rabbanan, as he tells us when it comes to the suffix tvila. Hadi rabbi. In the Mishnah, when he speaks about suffix erev kosher, he's quoting his Rebbe's opinion, who holds that we can be maker by suffix d'Rabbanan. Deikanami, the wording of the Mishnah, is also very indicative of this, that it's not his own opinion, diktane, because it says in the Mishnah, Amar Rabbi Yossi, Avtumus, so Avtumus was his Rebbe, Avtumus, Heid, he testified, Mishum Chamishos Kenim, Shesafik Erev Kasher, Shmamina. Indeed, we see from here that it wasn't Rabbi Yossi's own opinion. He was quoting his Rebbe, Avtumus, who was saying it over in the name of this Kenim, that Safik Erev is Kasher, but he himself personally holds, he meant to be Machmer, even by a suffix erev, just as he holds your macham by a suffix tvila. The third teretz, Rav Amar. Rabbi Yossi's halacha is based on chazak. Therefore, we can easily differentiate between erev and tvila. Hasam, hainu taima de Rabbi Yossi. Do you know why Rabbi Yossi holds when this person was tummy and he wanted to be toivel and he has a suffix of whether or not he was toivel? Rabbi Yossi says he maintains his tumah status. It's because he had a chazaka that he was tamei. Ha made the tamei al chazkasei. We want to apply this person's chazaka and say, well, just as you were tamei prior to your tvila attempt, let's assume that condition maintained itself and continued, and you're still tamei. Ve'emelei taval, and that leads us to say perhaps he did not toivel in the mikveh. In contrast with the erev, where we actually have two chazakis, two conflicting chazakis. On the one hand, we say, well, this person, up until his erev was placed at the erev side, was living in his home, and his tchum was around his home. So there's a chazaka, really, that a presumption that his shvisa, Shabbos residence, remains at home, unless proven otherwise, unless he relocated elsewhere. So there's chazaka that his shvisa is really at home, not at the erev side. On the other hand, we have a chazaka, the erev is kasher, because he placed the erev there, and at that point, the erev was perfectly fine, the truma was tar, so there's a chazaka, the erev was in good condition, continuously throughout Ben Hashmashes. Let's assume that it maintained its status, and was still fine and valid. So since we have two considerations that oppose each other, we have two chazakas, two conflicting chazakas. So since the tchumen concept is the Rabbanan concept, so we go the kula by the Rabbanan. That explains why Rabbi Yossi holds Sarvei Erev is kasher. But getting back to the mikveh, we only have one chazaka, to his detriment. He was a tamei person until now. Why say that he was tar? Unless proven otherwise, let's assume that his previous status of tumah maintained itself. And therefore Rabbi Yossi holds, over there we can't go l'kula, even though it's a tumah d'Rabbanan, but there's a chazaka that tells us that he's still tamei. And the tvila was in effect. Says the Gemara, Adarabba, just the opposite. Hamed mikval chaskasai. We had one case in the Mishnah there where there was a suffix whether the mikvah was kosher. So we had a kosher mikvah, and now we find that it's incomplete. It's missing some of the water. It doesn't have the 40 sa. Now we're not sure whether when this person was actually toivel, this mikvah had the full amount, was filled to the brim. So there's a suffix about the mikvah. In that case, says the Gemara, we have a chazaka actually that would tell us that this person had a proper tevilah. Adrabah, haved mikvah chaskasai. Ve'emalei chasar. We know initially this mikveh was full to the brim, had the full 40 saw. It was a kosher mikveh. Let's assume that chazaka continued throughout this period when this person was toivel. Ve'emalei chasar. Let's assume that it wasn't missing any water. So the case of Tvila is identical to the case of Erev. In this case as well, we have a chazaka that he had a proper Tvila. So that's more b'mikvah shloi nimdad. Actually speaking about a mikvah which was never measured properly, meaning it was never established as containing the proper amount of water. So there was never a chazaka established to begin with. Therefore, we must discount that consideration. All we're left with is this person's chazaka. He was tamei, and there's a suffix whether or not he removed his tumah through being toivel. And since there's a suffix whether or not the tefillah was effective, Rabbi says he maintains his tumah status, relying on the chazaka. So in summary, we have three approaches to answer the kasha. The first teretz was tumah is different because it is rooted in Torah. The second teretz was that when Rabbi tells us in the Mishnah, suffix erev kasher, it's the opinion of his Rebbe. And thirdly, this is Rava's approach, that Rabbi Yossi bases his opinion on chazaka. In our Mishnah, we have a chazaka to say that the erev was fine, in contrast with the person who was toivel, who actually has only a chazaka that tells us that he's tamei. Continues the Gemara, continuing along with this thread, the Rabbi Yossi is basing his shita on chazaka. Tanya, we learned in the Brisa, Keitzad Omar Rabbi Yossi, suffix erev kasher. What is the example where Rabbi Yossi speaks about suffix erev kasher? Meaning that we have the erev that has a cheskas kashrus, a cheskas tahara. Says the Brisa as follows: Erev b'truma. So he placed some erev material which was truma, and it became tamei. There's an uncertainty as to when that occurred. Suffix b'yom nitmis. So we have a suffix whether it became tamei by day, in which case during the Ben Hashmashas period, which is the activation moment of the erev, it was unsuitable. It was tamei. Suffix b'shachasheicha nitmis. Perhaps it became tamei only after nightfall, in which case, during Ben Hashmashas, it was still fine. So in this case, Rabbi Yossi says, the erev is kosher because we have a chazaka that this erev was fine, just as when you placed it there, it was still tar. Let's assume that status continued throughout Ben Hashmashas. Continues the Brisa with another example. V'chein be'peris. Likewise, a person used some fruit, which was tevel. Suffix b'yoim nitknu. There's a suffix whether it was mesukah, meaning the truma master was separated from it, which rendered it eder or made it mutter. We don't know whether that happened mi b'yoim while it was still day prior to Ben Hashmashas, in which case the erev is good. Suffix mishachashecha nitknu, or whether they were mesukah, they were fixed Ben Hashmashas after nightfall, in which case the erev is invalid because during Ben Hashmashas this was still tevel. Tevel is unsuitable for the erev. Zeu suffix erev kosher. This is an example. We have two examples of suffix erev which is kosher. Aval but erev truma. Let's say he used truma for his erev, and prior to placement of that truma at the erev site, he already knew that there was a suffix. There was some uncertainty as to the status of his truma. Suffix Torah, suffix tmeya. V'chein peris. Likewise, when he used fruit, suffix nitkenu, suffix le nitkenu, and he's not sure at the time of placement whether or not they were already mesukan or not, meaning whether truma mice is removed, making them mutter, or whether they were not yet removed. Ein zeh suffix erev kosher. This is not what we call a suffix erev which is kosher, because in these cases, there was no cheskas kashrus here. There was no chazaka to say, well, it's fine now, let's assume that status continued. Because when he placed the erev already then, he had a suffix as to the halachic status of this produce, of this erev. And therefore, there's no cheskas erev kosher. Okay. Says the Gemara, let's analyze the first two cases of the Brisa. So we had the first case where he placed some truma which was tar, then it became tamei. We're not sure when that happened, so we say fine. The truma has a chazaka. It was tar when he placed it there. Let's assume it was tar during Ben Hashmashas, and therefore it's kosher. The problem here is the second case. The Brisa tells us if he has some peris tevel, which he placed at the erev site, he doesn't know when he actually attended to this tevel to separate the truma and the maestros. He doesn't know what he did by day or night. In this case, we actually have a chazaka to tell us that this erev is no good, because when he placed it there, this thing was asher ba'achila. So why does the Brisa say that Rabbi Yossi would tell us suffix erev kasher? In that case, there's no chazaka to base it on. Says the Gemara, Maishna Truma. Why in the case of the Truma do we say Damrinan Ha made the Truma al Chaskasa? We say it's fine because let's apply the Chazak of the Truma and say, well, since it was tar when he placed it there, let's assume that it continued in that state, it was tar. We follow the Chazak. Piris Nami. Similarly, when it comes to the Piris Tevel, let's apply the Chazak and say, it's no good. Ha made Tevel Chaskasa. Let's adopt the chazaka of the tevel and say, well, this fruit had a chazaka that it was aser, because it was aser when you placed it there. Let's assume that status continues. Meaning, throughout Ben Hashmashas, this thing was not yet misukin. So if we follow chazaka by the truma, let's follow chazaka by the tevel as well and validate the erev. Says the Gemara, you're right. Let's amend the story here. Don't say that we had a case of Safik Vajoinit Knu. We used Tevel and we're not sure whether it was Mesukin, whether it was fixed up by day or not. That wasn't the case. El-Ema rather say as follows. The case was that he used proper chulin, food which was perfectly edible. The Trumas and Mice already separated. So what was the question? Safik Vajoim Nidmu. What happened was they were Nidma, meaning there was some Tevel that fell into them. We don't know when that happened. Whether it happened by day, in which case, during Ben Hashmashis, it was Asr. Or whether it happened only at night, in which case, during Ben Hashmashis, this food was perfectly edible, and the Erev is kosher. So in summary, we have two cases, where Rabbi Yossi would tell us, Safek Erev is kosher, based on a chazaka. Number one was a truma, which was placed at the site, which was tar at that moment. We'll assume it retained its tahara status, and it's kosher. Likewise, a case of perfectly suitable fruit, which had some tevel eventually mixed into it, which makes it asr. We're not sure when that happened. Let's assume the fruit maintained its permissible status and the erev is kosher. Continues the Gemara, Boy Rav Shmuel Rav Yitzchak Rav Huna. So he asked him the following question: Hoyu lefanav shtei kikris. So he had before him 2 loaves of bread of truma, achas tmeya, achas teira. One was tamei and totally inedible. Truma tmeya, nobody can eat, therefore you can't use it for the erev. V'achas teira, one was tar and perfectly fine. Problem is, he's unsure which is which. He has 2 loaves. He knows one of these 2 is fine, one isn't. V'amar irvuli b'teira b'chol makam shehi. He issues instructions. Please make this erev for me using these loaves. Place it at the erev site. And of course, you're going to use the tar one. Now we don't know which one's tar. Okay, so wherever he is, let that be my erev. You're going to place both loaves out at the erev site, and the erev should be activated by the one which is fine, which is tar. So here we have a situation where one of them is certainly fine. Problem is, he doesn't know which one it is, and practically speaking, he can't really access it. He can't eat it since he doesn't know which one is tar. Ma will be the halacha here. So we have a situation of kind of a suffix here, because each one is a suffix, whether it's edible. It says in Tiboy Rav Meir, the question will apply to Rav Meir Shita, who generally tells us suffix erev is pasul. Tiboy Rabbi Yossi, the question will apply according to Rabbi Yossi as well, who tells us suffix erev is kosher. Explains the Gemara. Tiboy Rav Meir, the question will apply to Rav Meir. Ad kan like Amar Rav Meir Hasan. It is only there when we have a suffix by the erev of the truma, when we don't know whether it was tamei prior to ben hashmashos or not. It's only over there perhaps that Rav Meir will tell us you can't rely on that erev. The leka tahira, because there's no certainty that there's anything tahir there. We must suspect that perhaps during ben hashmashos that truma was tamei. In contrast to our case, hacha hayika tahira. Over here we have one which is certainly tahir. One of these 2 is certainly fine, so perhaps according to Rav Meir, this error will be fine. Or perhaps, conversely, afilu Rabbi Yossi or afilu Rabbi Yossi, loika amar, even Rabbi Yossi, who generally tells us suffix erev is kosher, that's only loika amar ella hasam. That's only in that case where we placed 1 loaf of bread at the erev site. It's truma. Eventually it became tamei. He's not sure whether or not it was fine during ben hashmashos. It's only over there, strictly there, that Rabbi Yossi says, look, let's assume, based on the Cheskas Tahara, that loaf was perfectly fine during Ben Hashmashos. It's only over there that he says we can rely on it. Why? Because if indeed we assume that it's tar, He knows which one it is. It's one loaf. It's perfectly edible. Let's assume things worked out fine. It was Torah during Hashmashes, and it was accessible and edible. In contrast to our case, certainly you know one of them is fine, but he doesn't know which one it is. So perhaps even Rabbi Yossi would agree in this case, this type of suffix, the Erev cannot work. Amar lei, so Rav Huna responded, yes indeed, it won't work. Bein Rabbi Yossi, bein Rabbi Meir. According to both Shitas, it won't work because you need to have an edible Erev. When you establish that Erev, it needs to be ru'uya, an edible meal. Just because he knows that technically speaking there's something there that's edible, but he can't have access to it, that doesn't help him for his Erev. The Erev works by virtue of the fact that the person's food becomes his place of residence, it's his source of sustenance. If he can't have access to it, what good is it? Therefore, in this case, of the mixed up loaves, the Erev will not be activated. We don't have it here. Continues the Gemara with another Shaila. Rav asked Rav Nachman the following question. We know that an Erev Tchumen is activated, is Chal, during the Bein Hashmashes period, during that twilight zone between Friday and Shabbos, that transitional period, which has a din halachically of a suffix, of an uncertainty whether it is regarded as part of Friday or part of Shabbos. So what happens in the following case? Kikar zu, a person has this loaf and he says, this loaf of bread, hayoim choil u'lemachar kodesh. He's standing on Friday and he says, this loaf of bread today should be choil, it shouldn't be hegdish, but tomorrow, on Shabbos, this should become hegdish. Now we know that something which belongs to hegdish cannot be used for the Erev. V'amar, and he said, Erevu li bazeh. He issued instructions, use this loaf of bread for my Erev. Ma, what will be the halacha? So since the Erev is meant to be activated during Bein Hashmashes, shall we say that Bein Hashmashes belongs to Friday, in which case the implementation of the Erev precedes the arrival of the Hegdish, which only comes tomorrow, only comes on Shabbos, after nightfall. And therefore the Erev is fine. Or shall we say that perhaps Bein Hashmashes is classified, is regarded like Shabbos, like tomorrow, in which case the Erev can't work because once Shabbos comes, the Kedusha arrives on this loaf of bread, and it's unsuitable for Erev. So what's halach? Amar lei. So Rav Nachman responded, Eruv Erev, it works. The Gemara assumes that Rav Nachman is adopting a lenient approach. Let's assume that the Bein Hashmashes, which is a suffix whether it's Yom or Laila, suffix whether it's Friday or Shabbos, let's assume in this case Bein Hashmashes is considered to be Friday, in which case the Erev, which is Chal, which is implemented during Bein Hashmashes, precedes the Hegdish of the loaf, which only comes after nightfall, and therefore the Erev works. Okay, what about the next case? Hayoim kodesh l'machachol. He has this loaf of bread, and he says, today Friday, this loaf should be Hegdish, and therefore it's unsuitable for the Erev. U'l'machachol. However, tomorrow, on Shabbos, it should become chulin. The Kedusha should transfer to some money that I have at home, and this loaf of bread should no longer be Hegdish, in which case it can be used for the Erev. V'amar Erev li bazeh. And he issued instructions, use this loaf of bread for my Erev. Ma, what is the halacha here? So today, on Friday, it was Hegdish. Tomorrow, the Hegdish will be removed. The question is, the Erev is meant to be Chal, Bein Hashmashes. Shall we say that the loaf of bread was still Hegdish during Bein Hashmashes, because Bein Hashmashes still belongs to Friday, in which case the Erev can't use this loaf of bread? Or shall we say that the Erev, which is Chal during Bein Hashmashes, can work because Bein Hashmashes belongs to tomorrow, in which case the Kedusha has been removed? Amar lei, so Rav Nachman responded, in this case, Eini Erev, it doesn't work. Because during the time Bein Hashmashes, this loaf of bread is still Kodesh. Says the Gemara, so Rava asked him, Maishna, what's the difference between one case and the other? Rava assumed that Rav Nachman was basing his verdict on the concept of suffix. Bein Hashmashes is a suffix whether day or night. And in the first case, he assumed that the Bein Hashmashes could be regarded as day, and therefore when the Erev is Chal during that Bein Hashmashes, it precedes Shabbos, it precedes the Kedusha's arrival, the Kedusha on that loaf of bread, and therefore it works. So he adopts a lenient approach. He says, well, Ben Hashmashas is Friday. So everyone wanted to know, if you adopt a lenient approach, you say, misafik, it works. So why in the second case don't you say the same thing? Let's say Ben Hashmashas is regarded like Shabbos. So although the loaf of bread today is Kodesh, but on Shabbos it's not Kodesh any longer. So the Erev, which is meant to be activated during Ben Hashmashas, which in this case will regard like part of Shabbos, at that point the loaf of bread was no longer Hagdish. So if you're going Likula, you're saying like Suffolk Erev is kosher. So what's the difference between both cases? In both cases, we should work things out in a manner that the Erev is valid. Omar Lei, so Rav Nachman responded, L'chiseichel akura de milcha. I'll explain this to you. If you go eat a large amount, a core of salt. So I saw Rav Lezer Moshe Horowitz, he says, what he meant to say is, when you eat this large amount of salt, meant to make food tasty. When you eat this large amount of salt, you'll be able to, you have the ability to delve into you have the proper taste and proper understanding of this halacha. So it was in a joking manner. In any case, he proceeded to tell him the actual reason. He says, look, it's not a point of suffix here. The reason why I differentiated between both cases was that it was a definitive verdict. In one case, the Erev works, in one case it doesn't. So he proceeded to explain to him, in the first case, where today, Friday, this loaf of bread was chol, and only tomorrow was going to become hegdish. In that case, I maintain the Erev, which happens during Ben Hashmashas, can work. Why? Because at that point, the loaf of bread is not yet hegdish. Why not? Misfeika lo'nasa likdush. This person has no intent to bring about kedusha on this loaf of bread during that point of Ben Hashmashas, which is a period of uncertainty. He wants to do things outright, definitive, clear cut. So his intention initially, when he made this thing kodesh, was that the kedusha should only arrive after that period of uncertainty, after the Ben Hashmashas period. So therefore, the Erev precedes it and can use this loaf of bread for the Erev. It's perfectly fine. In contrast to the next case, Hayom kodesh l'machachol, when he said today this loaf should be kodesh and tomorrow on Shabbos should be chulin, in that case you cannot use it for the Erev. Misafi, you can't just remove the kedusha. You can't say, well, during the point of Ben Hashmashas, which is a period of uncertainty, let's assume this loaf is no longer kodesh, because the kedusha is meant to be removed after Friday. You can't do that, because there's a chazaka here. This loaf of bread today was kodesh. You can't go and just remove it without knowing with certainty the day is over. So this kedusha maintains itself throughout Ben Hashmashas, and therefore cannot be used for the Erev. So it wasn't on account of Safek Erev L'Kula, some sort of lenient approach. Rather, each case had its own unique reasoning to explain why one is mutter, one is asur. Tanan Hasam, we learned in the Mishnah, in Tvul Yom. Login Tvul Yom. Login is this pitcher. The Rimal Ketzedek says the reason why it's called login because it contained a log amount. So this pitcher was a Tvul Yom, meaning it became tamei, and then he was toivelit. But nightfall has not yet arrived. It didn't have hair of shemesh, in which case it's regarded like a sheni l'tumah. So it can be used for chulin, for ma'aserisha, but not for truma. It would make it tamei. So what do you do with this pitcher? Shemil'eu min ha'chavis shel maser tevel. He filled it with wine from a chavis, from a barrel which contained ma'aserisha, which was the portion given to the Levi, but it was tevel, meaning the truma of that maser was not yet removed. The trumas maser meant for the kohen was not yet separated. This maser at this point is asur b'achila. So he filled up this pitcher with this maser tevel. So far, so good, because the maser doesn't become tamei through this pitcher. For Amar, he said, "Ha'areza trumas maser l'kshatachshach." I would like that the content of this pitcher, this wine, should actually become trumas maser, the truma for the rest of the maser in that barrel. But when? Only during nightfall. Shetachshach, if it gets dark. In which case it'll be fine because the pitcher will have already arrived at its proper tahara, hair of shemesh, after nightfall. In which case it won't be matam the truma therein. So both things happen simultaneously. Nightfall brings about tahara for this pitcher, and it makes the content truma. Dvar of chayamin, it's perfectly fine. It works. However, if he added another element here, Vim Amar irvuli bazeh, he issued instructions. Use this for my erev. Lo yamar klum. Then it doesn't work. The Erev, as we just mentioned, is meant to take effect during Bein HaShmoshes. At that point, the food therein, this wine is still tevel, it's still masarishan, because the truma only takes effect when? At nightfall, when it gets dark, after Bein HaShmoshes. So this wine is asur b'achila and cannot be used for the Erev, and therefore the Erev is ineffective. Amar Rav Zoysa Meres. Apparently, we learn from here. Seif hayom kein Erev. So we mentioned Bein HaShmoshes is that transitional period, that transfer between day and night. Now there are two portions to that Bein HaShmoshes. There's the first part where the day transitions into that uncertain period, into that Bein HaShmoshes. That's called Seif hayom, where the Bein HaShmoshes comes into contact, attaches itself to the end portion of that day. In this case, it's Friday. We have the latter portion of the Bein HaShmoshes. Meaning, we know sometime throughout the Bein HaShmoshes, there will be that transitioning from Friday to Shabbos. We just don't know when within that period. We're uncertain as to the exact moment of that transition. But whenever it is, that's called the last part of the Bein HaShmoshes, which leads into the next day. That's called Tchilas Hayom. Says Rav, apparently the fact that he cannot use this wine for the Erev proves to us one thing. That which point of Bein HaShmoshes activates the Erev? It's the first portion of the Bein HaShmoshes, where the Friday transitions into that twilight zone. Seif hayom kein Erev. It's only then, the beginning of Bein HaShmoshes, that the Erev is activated. That explains why it doesn't work. Why? Because if you would suggest, you propose that it's the second portion of the Bein HaShmoshes, meaning where the Bein HaShmoshes transitions into Shabbos. It's called the Tchilas Hayom. If it's at that moment that the Erev is activated, so why doesn't it work in this case? That moment is the very same moment that nightfall arrives, that the pitcher becomes tar, that the truma comes into effect, and it becomes mutter. So in that case, if he issued instruction, use this wine for my Erev, Amar Lama Klum. Why didn't he say anything? Why don't we listen to him? Apparently, the Erev is meant to be implemented at the first portion of Bein HaShmoshes, where Friday reaches into that Bein HaShmoshes, that subject period. And that's still prior to the arrival of the Truma status to this wine. That only happens later, when the Bein HaShmoshes transitions into Shabbos. Amar Papa, not necessarily. Even if you say that's the last portion of Bein HaShmoshes, when the Erev is implemented, the Tchilas Hayom, meaning when Bein HaShmoshes transitions into Shabbos, even if that's the case, it still won't work in this case. Why? Because we don't really know when that happens. It's sometime during the Bein HaShmoshes. Now, although technically speaking, when that Erev is activated, whatever that moment is, that transitional moment between the Bein HaShmoshes and Shabbos, whenever that is, the Erev is activated and the Truma is activated and everything's fine and dandy. This food is totally accessible and edible. But since you personally don't even know, you don't know definitively, you can't point the finger and say, well, at this moment I could drink this wine, because it's unknown when that moment happens. It can't be used for the Erev. The point of the Erev is it's your food, it's your sustenance. It needs to be perfectly edible and accessible at the very moment that that Erev is activated, is chal. As opposed to this case, where you don't know when that moment comes. Therefore it won't work. So Prabhupada tells us, even if you'll say that technically speaking, everything happens simultaneously, the Erev is activated at the last portion of the Bein HaShmoshes, together with the Truma, it still can't be used. Why? In this case, we require that the food should be edible prior to Bein HaShmoshes. So you can point a finger at it and say, look, now it's edible. It's accessible. It's proper material for the Erev. But if you wait until the Bein HaShmoshes period to render this food edible, it can't be used for the Erev because you don't know definitively at what moment that's going to happen. So practically speaking, you have to wait until after Bein HaShmoshes to eat it or to drink the wine. So since at the moment of activation you don't have access to the food, it will not work for the Erev. So in summary, let's make a quick review of the last couple of pieces of Gemara. We began with a stira between Rabbi Yossi, who tells us in the Mishnah that Suffolk Erev is kosher, and Rabbi Yossi, who tells us Suffolk Tvila is tameh. The Gemara gives us three answers. Either because Tumah has an Ikar min HaTorah, we have some examples of Tumah min HaTorah, and therefore we can't be lenient when it comes to Tumah, for it might lead one to be lenient when it comes to Tumah min HaTorah as well. So we must be machmir even by Tumah d'Rabbanan. Another approach is Rabbi Yossi himself is machmir. In the Mishnah, he was quoting his Rebbe, who held that by the Suffolk d'Rabbanan, by Suffolk Erev, we can be mekel. The third approach of Rava was, we follow chazakos. So when it comes to the Erev, we have a cheskas, kashrus on that Erev, we assume that Truma continued and maintained its tahara status, just as it was tahara when he placed it there, as opposed to the person who was toivel, who was tameh initially. Let's assume that cheskas Tuma continues. The Gemara tells us that Rabbi Yossi's halacha is based on chazaka, and therefore if you have Truma, which was tahara prior to his placement, we assume that tahara continued. We have chulin, which are mutter. There's a suffix as to whether some tevel got mixed in. Let's assume the chulin maintained its permissible status, and therefore the suffix erev is kosher. The Gemara speaks about a case where you have two loaves of truma, one was tamei, one was tar. We say that can't be used for the erev because we need a proper suda, something which is edible. And in this case, he can't pinpoint to the one that's edible, and therefore it's unsuitable. Rav Nachman tells us in the case where he has a loaf of bread, he says today it's choil and tomorrow it's kodesh. It works because the kedusha only arrives after the point of ben hashmashes, after when the air was already activated. But in the case where he says today it's kodesh and tomorrow it's choil, that doesn't work because the kedusha can't just leave misafik. It needs to stick around till after ben hashmashes, and then it's too late for the erev. We learned that if a person has this login tefillah, this pitcher that contains wine, which is currently Maseches Eruvin, which will turn into truma when it turns night, he can't use that for the erev. We have two reasons. Rava tells us because the erev is meant to be chal, to be activated during the first portion of ben hashmashes, which is still prior to this wine turning into truma, in which case it's inedible and unsuitable. Rav Papa tells us, generally speaking, the suda needs to be roy, the food of the erev needs to be accessible and edible at that point of activation, which we don't have in this case because this person is unaware as to the exact moment when this wine will become a mutter. Continues the Mishnah. Masna adam al Eruvin. One has the ability to stipulate a condition with regards to his erev tchumen. What does that mean? Says Rashi, two lines from the top. Masnisin masna adam al Eruvin. He places a double erev, one on either side of the city. Maniach adam shnei Eruvin. Echad l'soif alpayim l'mizrach beisai. One situated 2,000 amos from the mizrach of his home, meaning towards the east of his home. The other one is situated 2,000 amos to the west. So he has an erev on the east side of his home and another one on the west side of his home. He covered all the bases. How could he use two erevs? The erev creates your makom shvisa, your Shabbos residence. You only have one Shabbos residence. Explains the Mishnah. Masna adam al Eruvin. So 5 lines from the top. Masna adam al Eruvin v'omer. And it says as follows: surely I'm only going to use one of those erevs, but I'm unsure which one I really need. So he places one on either side of the city, and he says like this: Im bo nachem min hamizrach. If the goyim come from the mizrach side and have to evade the goyim, get away from them, in which case I'd like to run towards Marav, Eruvin Marav, and the erev that I place on the Marav side should be activated. Min Marav, but if the goyim came from the Marav, Eruvin Mizrach, then my erev to the Mizrach should be the one that's activated. In bo lakan lakan, if they come from both directions, then I'll decide. I'll pick my choice. L'makom she'eretz eloich, I'll go in the direction that I choose to. So I'll decide which one should be my erev. Loy bo loy lakan loy lakan. If the goyim don't arrive from any direction, in which case I don't need the erev. Hareini kibnei iri. Then none of the erevs should be activated. Let's discount the entire process. I'd like to be just like the other members of my city, in which case I can walk 2,000 amos in any direction of this city. We have another example with a chacham on a positive note. Imba chacham min hamizrach eruvin mizrach. So again, this fellow placed a double erev, one to the mizrach, one to marav, and he says if the chacham will arrive from the mizrach, which case I want to go greet him, see him, and learn from him. Eruvin Mizrach, the Erev that I place to the Mizrach should be activated. Mina Marav becomes to the Marav side. Eruvin Marav, I want the Marav Erev to work, so I can go at a great distance to go meet the Rav. Ba Lakan, if two Chachamim arrive, one from either direction, then I'll decide which Erev I'd like to activate, which one I'd like to use. L'makom she'eretz elech, I'll go in direction which I choose. Lo Lakan, if no Chacham arrives, in which case I don't need the Erev. Hareina k'nei iri, let me just be like the other members of my city, and none of the two Erevs should be activated. Rabbi Daimer, im haya echad men rabbi, this is referring to the case where two Chacham arrived, one from either direction. Says Rabbi Yudi meant to know if one of them was his Rebbe, he's meant to go to his Rebbe. We assume that that is the one which he really wanted to use. The direction in which his Rebbe came. If both of them were his Rebbeim, certainly in that case, he can pick his choice, decide which direction he'd like to go. Continues the Gemara. He asked Rabbi Yitzchak. Rabbi Yitzchak came, he had a brisa. Tani ifcha kula masnisan. He had a brisa which switched around kula masnisan, the entire Mishnah. So in our Mishnah we discussed him evading the goyim, running away in the other direction. Rabbi Yitzchak's brisa described this person greeting, going towards the goyim. The Mishnah described him going towards the chacham. Rabbi Yitzchak had a brisa describing him evading the chacham. So you have a kasha. Kasha nachram anachram. You have a kasha from the two nachrams. Is he going towards them or running away? Kasha chacham achacham. We have a kasha from the two cases of chacham. In our Mishnah, he's going towards the chacham. And kasha is Rabbi Yitzchak's case where he's running away. What's the pshat? Says in one nachram anachram like kasha. The answer is like this. It depends what type of nachram. Ha bepar hagavana. Our Mishnah is speaking about the tax collectors, which he's trying to evade, and therefore he's running in the other direction. Ha b'mar demasa. Rabbi Yitzchak is speaking about governors, officials of the town, in which case he'd like to go greet them and meet them and discuss his communal affairs. Chacham acham like kasha, the apparent kasha between both cases of chacham is not difficult. Between our Mishnah, which describes this person going towards the chacham, and Rabbi Yitzchak described him going away from the chacham, the answer is like this. Depends what type of chacham we're speaking about. Haba Moisef Pirki. Our Mishnah is speaking about a chacham who's coming to offer a drasha. So he'd like to go towards that chacham. Haba Mirkishma. As opposed to Rabbi Yitzchak, who was describing a chacham who was coming to teach the small children how to daven. Meaning that he was faced with a choice. From one direction he had a chacham who was coming to teach the small children how to daven. From the other direction he had a chacham who was coming to offer a drasha. So certainly he's attracted. He prefers going to listen to the drasha. That's what Rabbi Yitzchak meant. He's going to activate the Erev to allow him to go towards the chacham offering the drasha and away from the direction of the other chacham who's teaching the small children how to daven. Continues the Gemara. So if there was a chacham arriving from either direction, and one of them happened to be his Rebbe, says Rabbi Yehuda, that Erev is going to be activated because he's meant to go to his Rebbe. And that's what he had in mind. But the chacham don't agree. V'Rabbanan, they hold, not necessarily. Zimnin d'nichle bechavri. Perhaps occasionally he prefers going to listen to his colleague, Tfemi Rabbi, better than his Rebbe. He's like a new approach, a new angle on things. So how do you know that he'll insist on going to his Rebbe? That's the Erev that's meant to be activated. Perhaps he prefers going to listen to a different drasha. You can't be sure which one is the proper Erev, and we leave it up to him. Omarav, lesa lemasnisin miditani ayi. Our Mishnah, which tells us that according to Rabbi Yehuda, if a person had two chachamim arriving from two directions, he can pick his choice and decide on Shabbos which one, which direction, which Rav, which chacham he'd like to go listen to, and retroactively that Erev will be activated retroactively from Ben Hashmashis. Says Rav, this halach in the Mishnah, which tells us that according to Rabbi Yehuda, we can apply the concept of breira. You can figure things out, verify things later on, and have it be implemented retroactively. It's not reliable. We can rely on this Mishnah. Miditani Ayah, because Ayah, the name of a Chacham, he taught us a brisa which tells us that Rabbi Yehuda does not hold of the concept of breira. Let's take a look at Rashi inside. 22 lines from the bottom. Says Rashi, less Masnissen. We must discount our Mishnah. Which portion of our Mishnah? The Ktani Rabbi Yehuda. The Mishnah tells us, according to Rabbi Yehuda, if two Chacham arrive from either side of the city, and they were both his Rebbes, then he can decide and choose in which direction he'd like to go. Alma apparently is Rabbi Yehuda Breira. Apparently Rabbi Yehuda employs and agrees with the concept of Breira, meaning that one has the ability to verify things now and have that applied retroactively to a process that has already begun yesterday. Why? When was this Eruv activated? Yesterday, during Ben Hashmoshes. V'ihu hashtahu the kabarle. And he's only making his decision now, tomorrow. And nevertheless we say, Hover hadavar, it's been verified, the me'es moil nami, daiti lahayava, that from yesterday, this was his intent. Meaning, the Eruv that was placed and established yesterday is a pending Eruv, an unfinished process, awaiting his tomorrow's decision, which will be implemented and applied and impact yesterday's Eruv. That's called Breira. To implement tomorrow's decision retroactively, that involves the halacha of Breira, and our Mishnah tells us, according to Rabbi Yehuda, Breira is applied. It says more less masnissen, we must discount our Mishnah. It's not reliable. Why? Since Ayay taught us, because we found that there's a brisa which Ayay taught, which contains a halacha that according to Rabbi Yehuda, Breira cannot work. You can't go ahead and create a process which is pending upon your decision of later, which will retroactively complete that unfinished process. You can't do that. Ayay says Rashi Shem Chacham. Okay, let's get back to the Gemara. 10 lines from the bottom. Omar Rav, lesel masnisin the Tani Ayay, you must discount our Mishnah in face of the brisa that Ayay taught, the Tani Ayay. Rabbi Doimer, ein adam masne, al shnei dvarim ke'echad. One doesn't have the ability to make a double condition, a double stipulation at once. Meaning, he's going to place an Eruv on either side of the city in preparation of two Chachamim who might arrive, and make that decision tomorrow, which will complete the process of the Eruv. He can't do that, because that requires Breira. Ella, what then can he do? He can place that double Eruv, one on either side of the city, in preparation of one Chacham's arrival. And he says like this, Im ba Chacham la-Mizrach, if the Chacham comes to the Mizrach side, Eruv la-Mizrach, so his Eruv, which was placed in that direction, will be activated. Im ba Chacham la-Marav, if he comes to the Marav, Eruv la-Marav. So that he can do, because he's preparing only for one Chacham. Ava lakana lakanlai. But to say, well, if two Chacham come, one on either side of the city, I'll make my decision tomorrow. Decide in which direction I'd like to go, which Chacham I prefer. And that Eruv should be activated retroactively, that he can't do. Because that involves Breira. Because the Eruv is yet an unfinished Eruv, it's awaiting tomorrow's decision, that doesn't work. Says for 1 second, what's the difference between one case and the other? It would appear that in both cases, Breira needs to be applied. Because in both situations, the Eruv has not even been completed. Even if he prepares only for one Chacham. He says, well, if he comes to Mizrach, that one should work. To Marav, that one should work. He doesn't know as yet in which direction the Chacham is going to come. So this Eruv is just an initiation of the process and awaiting completion when the Chacham arrives. Why does that not involve Breira? Says Ramashna, what's the difference? He can't say, well, if the Chacham come both directions, I'm going to pick my choice. That doesn't work. They ain't Breira. Lemizrach Lemarav Nami. In the case of Lemizrach, in the case of Lemarav, meaning there's one Chacham, just doesn't know which direction. In that case as well, ain't Breira. It shouldn't work because it's an unfinished process, awaiting the Chacham's arrival. So why in that case does Ayah tell us that it works according to Rabbi Yehuda? Says the Gemara, Rabbi Yechanan, Kvar ba Chacham. In the case of this single Chacham, you know what we're speaking about? The Chacham has already arrived prior to the onset of Shabbos. So when he prepared for that Chacham, he said, look, I'm placing an Eruv on either side of the city. And this Chacham, wherever he'll arrive, whichever direction he's going to come from, that Eruv should be implemented. And when that Chacham arrives prior to Shabbos, the Eruv which is in that direction becomes activated. So during Ben Hashmoshes, which is the point in the time where the Eruv needs to be activated, it's only one Eruv that becomes activated. And the process has been completed and finished. It's not a pending Erev. The Chacham is already here. That's why it works. In contrast to the case where he places the two Erevs and stipulates, look, I'm preparing for two Chachamim. Perhaps two Chacham will arrive, and then I'll decide, I'll pick my choice, which one I prefer, and which Erev should work. That's an unfinished Erev. That process has yet to be completed and is awaiting his decision, his tomorrow's decision, which must be applied retroactively. And that doesn't work. That requires Brera. Continues the Gemara. So Rav tells us that we must discount our Mishnah because of the Bryce of Ayah. Rav, just the opposite. Let's discount Ayah, which is only a Bryce. In view of our Mishnah, which teaches us otherwise. Our Mishnah is more reliable than a Bryce. You can't say that. Because we actually have another Mishnah, which indicates to us that Rabbi Yehuda does not hold of Brera, and therefore that proves to us that Ayah's version of events is the correct version. So in summary, the Mishnah tells us a person can make a Tanai on his Erev. He places one in either direction of the city, one in the Mizrach, one in the Ma'arav, and he says, if the Chacham comes from the Mizrach, or he comes from the Ma'arav, the Erev in that direction should be activated. If two Chacham come one in either direction, the Mishnah tells us that we can apply the concept of Brera, and he can choose tomorrow which direction he'd like to go and which Erev should be activated retroactively. Ayah teaches that according to Rabbi Yehuda, this doesn't work because Brera can't be applied. And the Mishnah also tells us that part of his condition is, if no Chacham arrives, in this case, I don't need any of my Erevs, none of them should be activated, and I'd like to be like the other members of my city. Okay, time for a brief review of today's daf. The Gemara discussed the halacha of Rabbi Yossi, who holds that a person who became Tameh, Tameh D'Rabbanan, and he had a suffix whether he was Toivel, would say he's Tameh. In contrast with our Mishnah, Risi tells us the suffix Erev is kosher. The Gemara gives us three answers. Either Tumah is more stringent because there are some forms of Tumah that are not Torah. Either, according to Rabbi Yossi himself, the suffix, even the Rabbanan will be Tameh, the suffix Erev wouldn't be good, but in the Mishnah, he was quoting his Rebbe who holds suffix Erev is kosher. Rebbe tells us, the case of the Erev in our Mishnah involves a chazaka that tells us we have reason to believe the Truma maintains its earlier status and is still tar, and therefore basically says suffix Erev is kosher. In contrast with this person who was Tameh, who has a cheskas Tumah, and we presume that cheskas Tumah continues throughout and the tefillah was invalid. The Gemara tells Rabbi Yossi's halacha of suffix Erev kosher is only when there's a chazaka that tells us that it's probably fine. For instance, the Truma, when it was established for the Erev, was tar. We assume that situation continued. The Chulin was mutter. We assume it continued throughout Ben Hashmashis. The Gemara tells us if a person has two loaves of bread of Truma, one is Tameh, one is tar, he can't use that for his Erev because it's not Suda Ru'uyah. He doesn't know which one's mutter. He has no real access, practical access to that food. When a person took a loaf and he said, today it's Chayil and tomorrow on Shabbos it should become Kodesh, that Erev works. Because the Kedusha only happens after Ben Hashmashis. But if he says, today it's Kodesh and tomorrow it's Chayil, in this case it doesn't work. Because the Kedusha is maintained throughout Ben Hashmashis, and therefore the Hekdesh can't be used for the Erev, which is meant to be implemented during Ben Hashmashis. If a person takes a pitcher, which is Tzful Yoim, and has some Ma'aser Rishon in there, which will turn into Truma at night, and he says, I want to use this as my Erev, it doesn't work. Rabbi explains because the Erev is meant to be Chal. At the first portion of Ben Hashmashis, which is still before it became Truma and edible. Rabbi says the reason is because the food of the Erev needs to be edible. In this case, since he doesn't know the exact moment when the wine would become edible, it's unsuitable for his Erev. We learned about a case where a person places a double Erev, one on either side of the city, makes it tonight. If the Goyim, or in the case of the Chacham comes from the Mizrach, I'd like to use that Erev. He comes from the Ma'arav, I'd like to use that Erev. That works. If two Chacham come, I'd like to make my choice. Ayah tells us, according to Rabbi, that doesn't work. And if nobody shows up, I like to be like the other members of my city. And my Tchum should extend 2,000 Amma from all directions of the city.